I'll say this. March is coming. March is coming, and we will talk about that on today's show. I'm not just saying that because football season is officially over, but as I'll allude to later in the episode, this weekend, I feel like in college basketball, at least in this state, it's been a minute since we've had a weekend like that. We got two teams, two good programs in this state at the top of the Big Ten standings in mid to late February. This is going to be a really fun final month of the season. Then, I mean, of course, it's going to be a fun March. I mean, every March is fun, whether your team is in it or not. We'll talk about that. Just real quick, a few programming notes. Obviously, you can find us on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on YouTube. Hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button. If you like all our content, you can go to CastellaniContent.com. There you'll find access to everything that we do. Very perfectly organized, well put together. Yeah, I think that should do it. Trying to be quicker with these. I want to move at a good pace. I'm going to spend most of this time talking about Michigan and Detroit-based stuff, but I do want to start by talking about the Super Bowl. I'm not going to review the broadcast or review the commercials or anything like that. People much smarter than I can do that. This was one of the great shit pumpings in Super Bowl history, quite frankly. And really, I think the question people are going to ask is, was this the worst Super Bowl ever? The answer to that is like emphatically no. Okay, first off, there were a lot of duds like before I was born. I would say generally speaking, and I was born in 95, the Super Bowl more often than not is pretty darn competitive, and we've had some great ones, over the last few decades. This was a dud. Congratulations to Philly and their fans. I mean, there's a ridiculous, unbelievable run they had when you look at it. I mean, they were, they finished the year 18-3. I mean, an incredible season on their part, full redemption after losing the Super Bowl 2 years back. At the same time, the reason I can't put this as the worst, now it's bottom 10, but the reason I can't put it the worst is the same reason I couldn't put the Bucs Chiefs one near the bottom, which was because I was, at least from a football perspective, fascinated by the performance that one team had against Kansas City. 4 years back, it was Todd Bowles' defense and Tom Brady obviously winning his final Super Bowl against Patrick Mahomes. And in this game, it was Vic Fangio's defense just overwhelming Kansas City. I have never seen, whether it's postseason, regular season, preseason, what have you, a Patrick Mahomes-led offense be completely stifled like that. And while Jalen Hurts was the MVP and was far and away the best player on the field, and we'll talk about him in a second, the real MVP of this game was Vic Fangio. I mean, this was an iconic defensive performance by a defense that was great all season, but you do it in the Super Bowl, you really cement your legacy. That was incredible. And then, yeah, like I said, Jalen Hurts deserves a ton of credit. Obviously was a huge recruit coming out of high school, gets beat out by Tua at Alabama when he comes in and wins the national championship. He transfers to Oklahoma, becomes a Heisman finalist, drafted in the second round by the Eagles. A lot of doubters, but is this guy going to succeed in the NFL? Even after taking a team to a Super Bowl, there were still some concerns last season about what the future looked like with him. He was incredible. That's a nice little story, and he was fantastic. I mean, it's crazy that Philly was as dominant as they were, with Saquon Barkley, by his standards, really being held in check. Now, he does finish off one of the great running back seasons we've ever seen, and Barkley was just amazing all year. But yeah, this was Hurts' moment, and it was Philly's moment. And now you got to really, in terms of legacy, you got to talk about Howie Roseman being one of the great GMs this game's ever seen. I mean, the Eagles had 0 Super Bowls before him. They have 2 after him or with him. They've made it to 3, almost won a third. They're going to be back. They're going to be very competitive for a long time. I guess to kind of turn this into a Michigan conversation or a Detroit conversation, the question people are wondering is like, do I feel any better about the way things ended for the Lions during this campaign? The answer is no, because the Washington game was still an all-time choke job, just a complete egg that was laid, total gag. At the same time, while I think at full health, I do still believe the Lions were the best team in football this year. You have to take injuries into account. And I do think had the Lions played the Eagles in the NFC Championship, even if it was at Ford Field, I think they would have had a hard time winning. Now, I would have much rather lost that game and played them than, thrown a complete dud against Washington and never had the opportunity. So it still stings a ton. But coming away from this, I do more often than not think that the NFL is as consistent as any league of actually crowning the best team champion. I think it was pretty fair to say, especially with the performance they put together on Sunday, that the best team in the NFL by the end of the season was the Philadelphia Eagles, and it's a big reason why they're hoisting a Lombardi today. All right, let's move on. Let's talk some hoops, man. Obviously, Michigan basketball had a 2-0 week. Michigan State went 1-1. Though I do feel like I'll have a fair amount to say about Michigan State because the one game that they did win was, I'm not going to call it a classic necessarily, but it was one of the more memorable home games I feel like that a Tom Izzo team has seen in recent memory. But we are going to start here by talking about Michigan. Like I said, 2-0, still very much in the thick of things in the Big Ten race. And now, look, we're relatively deep into the season at this point. And with college basketball teams, the way that I view them, it's so much different than how I view college football teams, where I feel like coming into a college football season, sans maybe one or two elements, you have a general idea of what that team is going to be, right? Like Michigan football, whether they're good or bad, lately, obviously, they've been quite good. They have a general identity that you come to expect out of Michigan football. Now, coming into this season, not only were the players completely different, the coach was different, and the scheme was different. So I've been very patient with this team. I feel like you've got to be patient with college basketball teams, especially when talking about a group that has so many transfer portal guys. And now we're reaching this point in the season in mid-February where this team they are exciting. They are frustrating, and they are also bizarrely redundant because they played 2 games this week, and they were kind of mirror images of each other. They played Oregon at home and won, and they played Indiana on the road and won, and both games are pretty similar. The first half, they lit it up. They looked great. They limited the turnovers. They were moving at a tremendous pace. They were hitting their shots. I thought Trey Donaldson, the first half of both games, looked really good. Danny Wolf coming alive. I mean, it was this team as that fully operational Death Star that I've talked about, what their ceiling can be when they're playing at a good pace and not turning the ball over. And in the second half of both games, even the home game, it's that stretch. And it starts with turnovers. And you can see it coming from a mile away. And I've brought this up in every single post game that I've done during the Big Ten season. But until they stop doing it, I'm going to keep talking about it, which is this team will find themselves up 10 to 15 points on the verge, and you see this in a lot of games. There's that point in the second half of a lot of blowouts when a team really tightens their grip, and all of a sudden that 10-point lead becomes 20, and you can start to see the other team beginning to concede a little bit as they really start to get dominated. And Michigan, you see it. They take these double-digit leads, and it'll start with here's a turnover on this possession. All right, Trey Donaldson just threw a ball away. Danny Wolf just dribbled off his foot. Oh, that was a good look. They missed an open three. Wait a minute, it's a 5-point game now? Wait a minute, it's a tie game now? And before you know it, it's right back in the thick of things. Very competitive. And I'm going to be mildly critical here. But before I do that, I just want to say I'm very proud of this team, and I think that this has been a very fun team and a fun season. Okay, Michigan basketball is very much back, and Dusty's going to do a remarkable job here. I know that there's some rumors about the potential Indiana job. I will talk about that, but they revamped their roster in the portal. They got some good, exciting players. I think the culture here is as good as it's been since the Beeline era. There's a lot to be excited about with this team. And the reason I am going to be critical of them here is because I think that there's a really high ceiling for this ball club. I think when they are playing at their best, they are a matchup nightmare with the length they have, the shooters they have, their ability to space the floor. I really do think that this can be a second, even third weekend team. Now they could be a first weekend team too. They could be a first round team. As I've said in the past, there's boom or bust as it gets. So I don't want that to go to the wayside. We have seen a pretty remarkable turnaround here in year one under Dusty May. But when you are a team that seemingly has one real issue, and you are repeatedly allowing that issue to rear its ugly head, that's kind of where I get frustrated. It's like, I mean, if you want to make an analogy, it's like the Tigers over the last several years, where maybe not last year, but for a majority of last year, where, the pitching's really good, and I'll acknowledge the pitching and the job the bullpen's doing, the job Chris Fetter does, and it's just that offense. They're just not hitting, and it'll frustrate you because you fall behind 1-0 and you're going to have a tough opportunity, tough chance of coming back. And what it is with this team is you'll see them play high-level basketball, and they'll get into the second half of games, and something will just happen. We're just going to call it the stretch. That's what it is. It's that 5 to 10 minute window where it starts with the turnovers, and then all of a sudden they're not making open shots. They're not spacing the floor properly. The defense, generally speaking, has been pretty darn good, and I want to acknowledge that, especially against Indiana. Nothing was really coming easy, and I think that's one of the big differences, maybe the biggest difference between this year's team and the teams over the last few years is that this team defensively is tough enough to survive some of those stretches when they're not putting the ball in the basket, whereas in the past, like in the Juwan era, if they went a 5-minute stretch without scoring, like they were going to give up 10 to 15 points. I think defensively, this team, both in terms of their on-ball defenders at the perimeter and the guys down low like Vlad Golden, they're a pretty darn solid defensive group. But you get into that stretch and you see the game slipping away. And I'm thinking to myself out loud, what am I going to say in this post-game video, other than, it's exactly what we've seen in every other loss. It's they get a lead and they let it slip away. And it's where, and Dusty even talked about it a little bit, you do have to give this team a lot of credit for the way that they don't panic in these very tense situations. I know Indiana is a mess and Mike Woodson's leaving at the end of the year. And look, that program as a whole hasn't been anything special in a long time. But you're on the road against a team that it's an emotional game for Indiana. Dusty May coming back. Woodson just announced he's stepping down at the end of the season. You're up 2. I think it was even tied late. And they just settled down and they just ran the offense. And I truly, for the life of me, do not understand the Jekyll and Hyde nature of this ball club, where they will panic when they are up 15 and they will calm down when it's a 2-point game or a tie game. And that's, it's a double-edged sword, because on one end, I am so confident, like as confident as I've ever been in anything, that if and when this team loses in March, it's going to be because of that stretch where they just can't get out of their own way, where they're beating themselves and they're missing shots, where they can't stop turning the ball over. But I also have a lot of faith that if they get into a close game, which is what you're going to play in March. I mean, nobody nowadays in March, every game you play in the NCAA tournament is a tough game. It used to be if you were 1 or 2 seed, that first game's kind of a cakewalk, maybe even the first 2 games, not anymore. Anybody can beat you and you can beat anyone. And that does give me some hope that when they get into these close games, they have the ability to make plays down the stretch. Penn State, Oregon, Northwestern, Indiana. Those are 4 close games. Those are 4 basically coin flip games that they won because they finished at the end of ball games. Against Indiana, they finished, whether it was offensively with Danny Wolf taking over, defensively with the really good defense of the perimeter against Penn State, or some of the really good on-ball defense down low. They have the ability to finish. It's just these stretches in the middle of the second half where you question if they know what they're doing at all. One thing I want to just add to, because I talked about it last week, is the importance of Danny Wolf. I think one of the really positive qualities about this team is the fact that they have several different scorers who can beat you on any given night. It could be Donaldson, it can be Namari, it can be Vlad Golden. At the same time, I genuinely think the player with the highest ceiling on this team is definitely Danny Wolf. I think that this team, this offense, is at their best when Danny Wolf is playing his best and he's not turning the ball over. It's weird because I think the offense should run through Trey Donaldson in regards to the ball handling, but I feel like the go-to scorer late in games should be Danny Wolf, and that's what we saw against Indiana. Look, the guy's a freak, okay? He's 7'1", he can dribble between his legs, he can dribble behind his back, he can shoot fadeaways, make threes. I mean, he had that underhand layup, that and one late in the game against Indiana. That's an unstoppable play. You can't guard a 7-footer who's driving from the 3-point line, going down to the block and making finger roll layups from the free throw line, right? The guy has insane length. I think, again, he is symbolic of everything that is sometimes wrong with this team, where it feels like he's in his own way as a player. It seems like he tries to do too much as a player sometimes. That was not so much the case during this week, especially against the Indiana game. I thought he was the best player on the floor. And I saw somebody said a tweet that said if this guy was from Slovenia, he'd be the number 3 pick in the draft. I can't go that far, but I do think the mold, the Nikolai Jokic, Luka Doncic mold that NBA GMs salivate over nowadays is like, that's Danny Wolf light, so to speak, where or Danny Wolf is the light version of that, where the ceiling is incredibly high, the intangibles are there, but I feel like sometimes he feels a need to take over games on his own when you don't have to. This is a deep enough team, and it's a talented enough team where he doesn't have to do too much, especially with what he does passing. I feel like sometimes he tries to get way too fancy with the ball handling and the passing behind his head, stuff like that. Just run the offense, and when they do, it's a consistent, fun offense to watch. They space the floor and they can hit their outside shots. One more thing here, and then I want to talk about Michigan State. But I got to say, my expectation for this team, when I saw the roster, when I saw the players that they brought in through the portal. My expectation was I hope and think that they should make the NCAA tournament. Michigan hasn't made the NCAA tournament in 3 years. For a first-year coach coming over from Florida Atlantic with an entirely revamped roster, I figured that'd be a nice, feather in the cap. They're making the tournament. Okay, I mean that's without question. They could collapse down the stretch, and they're making the tournament. I gotta say, it felt really nice. It felt cool on Saturday. Kind of like, it felt like the old days, man. Like I was like back in high school or college watching, the Beeline Izzo era where you got Michigan and Michigan State playing at the same time. Both of these teams are top 20, top 25 ball clubs. Both of them are at the top of the Big Ten standings. You're not only watching Michigan, but you're scoreboard watching Michigan State just to make sure that, to see what they do. That's really exciting. I mean, it's like a divisional race in baseball. And as much as we love March, and I would agree that NCAA tournament is far and away the most unpredictable and fun postseason there is, I really do love when you have your team at the top of the Big Ten standings. You're kind of paying attention to what other teams are doing. And the fact that a year removed, and I understand, it's an entirely different situation, and college basketball and college sports in general have completely changed in regards to the transition between one coach to another. But the fact that this was a team a year ago with 8 wins, and we were praying for that season to be over in January. I mean, when the calendar turned to the new year, Michigan hadn't even beaten Alabama in the Rose Bowl, and we were praying for the college basketball season, at least as far as Michigan was concerned, to be over. I predicted this would be a pretty fun year for basketball in the state of Michigan, and to be honest, up to this point, it's exceeded my expectations. The fact that it's now February 10th, and we're talking about 2 teams that are at the top of the Big Ten standings, it's a testament to these players, and it's a testament to the job that both of these excellent coaches have done this year. Speaking of excellent coaches, master of segues, let's talk about Michigan State, a group led by Tom Izzo. They went 1-1 this week. Quite a bit to talk about, especially with that second game. Look, last week they finished out the week by losing on Saturday to USC. Come on here, and I said, look, it's the Big Ten road syndrome. They got off to a bad start. Crowd was in the game for USC. They really needed it. They needed it more than Michigan State needed it. And there wasn't a whole lot to really take out of that loss other than Michigan State was human. They go to Pauley Pavilion during the week, and they lose to a UCLA team that is getting a lot better. I mean, they looked much more competitive and much tougher than they looked when they played Michigan at home early in the season. But Michigan State lost a very close game. I mean, it came down to the final seconds. UCLA scored with 6-7 seconds left to go up in front. Akins missed a 3 at the buzzer. And even then, look, it doesn't feel good to lose. It doesn't feel good to lose 2 in a row. I still maintained the belief that Michigan State is the favorite in the conference, that they are the class of the Big Ten, which is what I referred to them as. And then the first half against Oregon happened. And this is how my brain works, which thankfully, I don't know if this is how anybody else's brain works, but when I'm watching a sporting event, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say in my post-game videos, or in the case of Michigan State, I think about what I'm going to be saying on these podcasts. And I was going to come on here after that first half against Oregon, assuming that things continued, and said, there's legit trouble in paradise. 3 losses in a row. And the way that Michigan State was losing to Oregon in that first half on Saturday, it was so unlike the way that we see Tom Izzo teams lose. Look, it was an emotional game, 25th anniversary celebration of the 2000 team. You got Jason Richardson back watching his son. You got Mateen Cleaves, Morris Peterson. I mean, Izzo's only national championship, legendary team, right? And Oregon in the first half was shooting lights out. And Oregon, for a team that I think has lost like 6 in a row now, there is talent there and they're shooting there, but they were showing it at halftime. The separation that Oregon was getting on some of these 3-point shots was just ridiculous. I mean, this is for a Tom Izzo team, or a Tom Izzo program that, talks so much about toughness and playing good defense. I mean, these guys were getting wide open looks and knocking them down. Then you had a long 3 at the end of the first half where it was just like everything was kind of falling. Found themselves down 14, gave up 50 points in the first half against Oregon. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I'm going to have to make some amendments in regards to how I feel about this Michigan State team, in regards to how I feel about where they stack up amongst the rest of the conference. And then Michigan State came out in the second half, and they probably could have beaten the Pistons. I mean, they just played as good as they've played in weeks, a completely dominant effort. And one question that was starting to get asked amongst Michigan State people, and I think it was a fair point, is the fact that throughout this season, the number one thing that Michigan State has hung their hat on is their depth and how many guys they play and how many guys who can score. And that's great. And I think that makes them a very difficult outcome the NCAA tournament. But they've played a few close games in a row now, and I think some people are starting to wonder, late in the game, no matter how deep of a team you have, you need somebody who can be a go-to bucket. Who is it for this Michigan State team. Now, I've always defaulted to Jay Nakins just because 4-year player, 1,000-point scorer. He's been around the program for a long time. He should be their kind of go-to guy late in games. But who is it? Apparently, the answer is Jace Richardson. Because on Saturday, Jace Richardson, the freshman, starting for Jeremy Fears, who was out, which that is a big loss. I mean, Jeremy Fears is one of those players who I feel like impacts the game way more than the numbers might indicate, just because I think he's done such an effective job of running the offense this year. Even if he's not scoring or collecting assists, I think that the guy he's had a really solid year. He's out. Jace Richardson, it starts that game, and in the second half completely takes over. Oregon could not guard the guy. He was slashing, he was shooting, he was playing defense. It was really a remarkable performance. I mean, he just took hold of the Breslin Center, which was loud on Saturday, and we'll talk about that in a second. Look, on a human level, I thought that was just a very cool moment. You got his dad there, who was a part of the national championship team, second generation Izzo players. Izzo obviously coached his father, and Jay Rich had an unbelievable career in the NBA playing for the Warriors and several other teams. So that's just, from a human standpoint, that's a very cool moment and a cool thing to watch. But in terms of what it means for this team, you can't expect him to do that every game, but it's clear that version of Jace Richardson exists. And if they get anything close to that version late in the season, the ceiling for this team elevates. And I've been high on this team for a while now. They've surprised me at every turn, but I did not expect this from the freshman. I mean, the way he was playing. Now he looked, I don't want to speculate here, he looked like an NBA guy on Saturday. Now that probably means he'll make that blood oath with Izzo that his players make, or he'll be in the program for 8 years and he'll be killing Michigan for 2 presidencies. But that's beside the point. A remarkable performance. And honestly, I thought Michigan State in the second half, they brought the emotion. They came along with the crowd, and they played as good as they've played in quite a while. I overdo it when I say stuff like, season saver, but yeah, I mean, if they end up winning the Big Ten, I think that's a game that people are definitely going to circle. And I just want to point out one thing, and it's not so much about Michigan State, because we know where they are. They remain at the top of the Big Ten standings, 2 losses. That was a huge win on Saturday. But as I mentioned earlier, Oregon was up 14 at the end of the first half. Hey, any team can come back from a 14-point deficit, right? It's not insurmountable, but it's in college basketball, it's a fairly big lead. And Michigan State came out, they got a few quick buckets to start the second half, and the game was over because the Breslin Center crowd completely took over that game. And Oregon, for the last 20 minutes, they couldn't run a set. They were up by 8 with 18 minutes left in the game, and you would have thought that they were down 20. I mean, they were shook, and it just speaks to something that maybe I've alluded to or other people have talked about, but I've really started to see shine through during this Big Ten season. I've never been a huge rah-rah original Big Ten guy. Like, I'm not one of those, root for the Big Ten. Like, every team in the Big Ten has broken my heart at some point. So, I'm not big on that. At the same time, now that there's 20 fucking teams in the Big Ten, watching it in basketball, it's a little bit different in football, but watching it in basketball, these West Coast teams, they are not prepared for the environments in the Big Ten. I'm sorry, because Oregon, look, came into the year, they were top 10 team, top 15 team, and they went to Chrysler and lost, and then they go to Breslin. And I'm not saying Breslin's an easy place to play. In fact, I think it is far and away the most difficult place to play in the conference. But sports and sports fandom, dude, it's a Midwest thing. It just is. Like, you're seeing the Michigan and Michigan State crowds at Pauley Pavilion were outnumbering the UCLA fans. And these Oregon guys, here's the thing with Breslin Center, okay? And I know this, and this is actually meant to be a compliment and not an insult. I've grown up in this area my entire life. Every person who steps foot in Breslin Center is pissed off about something. Right? That's not to say they're bad people or they're pissy people, but I live here. It's the middle of winter. The weather sucks. Your car doesn't start right. Your coffee wasn't hot enough. Your mother-in-law's pissing you off. These are just things that happen in Michigan. This is Midwest values. When you're playing in Pauley Pavilion or you're playing at Oregon, like, what's their big concern, right? Like, your fucking caviar didn't taste good enough. It's just different here. And while I could see Oregon and UCLA and some of these teams adjusting, I thought it was noticeable on Saturday the way that Oregon just folded when the Breslin Center crowd came back into that game. And that's not to say that teams like Illinois or Michigan or some of the other better, more established teams in the Big Ten won't struggle in that environment either. But I just felt like it was very noticeable on Saturday that was a program that was not used to playing in that arena. And by the time Michigan State was trailing, like cut it to single digits, it felt like the game was over. Also want to give a quick shout out, because I'm talking so much about J.S. Richardson. I want to give a quick shout out to Jackson Kohler, who I thought played one of his better games. He's another guy, man. I think I might have said this on a live stream. I might have even said it on the podcast. There's that Izzo guy, every deep tournament run that Izzo has, who really emerges at some point. Now, I don't know if Kohler will do it this year, but my prime example is Goran Sutan, who I thought was just a totally whatever player for his first 3.5 years, and then just went nuts in March in 2009 when they made it to the national championship and lost to North Carolina. I don't know if Kohler has that in him, but he was a big reason for their success. I mean, he was an animal on Saturday. He was an animal on the glass. I believe he had a double-double, had some big plays. And, yeah, defensively, Izzo said he begged. Now, I don't know what his definition of that is, but to be completely honest with you, I shudder at the horror that was bestowed upon these young men at halftime of that game when they saw the scoreboard and knew that they'd given up 50 at home to Oregon. They came out and they just dominated. It was a fun game. I mean, it really was. And I understand that I'm going to get criticism, and this has happened before, from people saying, why are you so complimentary about MSU and so critical of Michigan? First of all, I don't think I'm that critical about Michigan. I think I'm pretty fair with this team. I love this team. I think I've said a million times, I think they have a very high ceiling. I've played into this before, and maybe now that I have the podcast, it's more noticeable. I have always, at least as an adult, as somebody who's with a mildly functioning brain, always appreciated and liked the job that Tom Izzo does and the program that he's built. And the fact is, we live in this age with the portal and NIL, and I don't speak ill of a lot of that stuff, especially the portal. These kids got to go where they got to go to. There's no real frustration with that. But I really do think, we talked about it with Stoney on Chris and Company, that Izzo in a lot of ways is the last of a dying breed of coaches. I think this idea of a guy staying for 30 years, having this many 4-year guys, coaching guys' sons, I mean, I don't know if we're going to see that in college basketball for a really long time. And whether he wins a second championship or not, like, I do appreciate that. And I mean, I've been to Breslin Center many times. I know how loud it can get, and you didn't even need to be there on Saturday to know how crazy that was. So yeah, fun Big Ten season so far. One last update here, man. And I feel like these segments are getting so redundant, but the saga is getting redundant. Nothing on Alex Bregman right now. Bob Nightingale report came out this week that Bregman's still asking for 6 or 7 years. It's a stalemate. I mean, Bregman is hoping that one of these teams flinches, and one of these teams is hoping that Alex Bregman flinches. I think Boris has screwed this up. I think he screwed it up with Pete Alonso. I think he screwed it up with Alex Bregman. I've mentioned it before, but I think Scott Boras is an elite agent to have when you are a player at the top of your game. The way that Ohtani was, right? Like, Ohtani got $800 million for a reason. Boris played it perfectly. Bregman, God bless him, wonderful player. I want him on the Tigers, but this is not 2019 Alex Bregman. And I think he's looking for 2019 Alex Bregman money, and he's not going to get it. I have no idea how this ends. I have no idea if he just defaults, heads back to Houston, ends up taking a short-term deal in Detroit. It's not out of the realm of possibility. It's not off the table that he comes to Detroit. I think really there's 3 teams that kind of seem to be in on him. I'd give him an equal chance of getting Alex Bregman. The one thing, though, and this is Mike Valenti had a segment about it, and God bless him. I do actually respect what he was saying here, which is you are reaching a point where you've made your offer for the guy, right? He's a good player. He'd make the team better. Like, at a certain point, it's the ball's in his court to make a decision. And if he chooses not to come here for whatever reason, whether it's the park or the money, what have you, so be it. I do agree with that. And we are reaching a point where I start to get concerned, and I'm rarely like this, but where I start to get concerned and think, okay, I mean, does he want to be here? Because it kind of seems like he doesn't. And I say all this now, but the fact is, I know I'd say April, come May or spring training, Tigers are going to be down 1-0, leaving 25 guys on base in a 9-inning game. And I'm going to be saying to myself, God damn it, why didn't you sign Alex Bregman? So for the time being, I still want him here. But this saga has gotten annoying, and I'm not even mad particularly at any one player. I just think that the process as a whole is something that I would like to see Major League Baseball work on, because there really isn't such there's a lukewarm stove like once every 2 weeks. Besides that, stove ain't that hot in the offseason, which is too bad, because I think free agency can really be a very fun thing, not just for baseball, but for all sports. So One more thing I left out, and it's about Michigan basketball. Dusty May returned to Indiana, where I believe he was like a video assistant for Bobby Knight or something back in the day. Somebody told me that Dusty May once said Indiana was a dream job. I don't know if that's true, but he has Indiana ties. And of course, Mike Woodson announced that he's going to be stepping down at the end of the season, leading to much speculation. I'll just keep this short. I would be absolutely shocked if Dusty May is not the coach at Michigan next year. I think he loves it here. I think he wants to win here. I think the resources are here. I think it's a better job than Indiana, straight up. I mean, Michigan's been to 2 Final Fours since 2002. Indiana's been to 0. I mean, have they been to an Elite 8? I mean, they've had a few good years with Crean, but they ran Crean out of town. I mean, even that Crean left a while ago now. I mean, it's ancient history at this point. But some people pointed to the very, very diplomatic answer that Dusty May gave when asked about the Indiana job at the press conference, which it was the first question at his post-game press conference after they beat Indiana. And the fact is, I took very little from it because 2 things can be true. I think Dusty May is going to stay here, and I think he wants to win here. But he's a smart guy, and I think he's also aware of how in demand he'll be. And regardless of how this season ends, I see him getting probably a nice little pay bump, nice little pay increase at the end of this campaign. He's done an excellent job this year in his first year at Michigan. And 2, and a lot of times when people use this word, they take it as a negative, but I don't really think so. I think it's just believing in yourself. I think there's an ego part of this. I think it is probably very appealing to Dusty May, knowing that he has the opportunity to get on the phone with the powers that be at Indiana and say no. That has to feel good. Like you want me, bitch, and I'm right here, sorry, in the same conference. Like I don't mind him for that. I hope he is that petty, to be completely honest with you. And I could be way off with my my assessment there. Look, I'm sure they'll make a push for him, but I have very little concern. I think he's in a good place right now. I think the program's in a good place right now. It is something I wanted to address because it became they were talking about it on the broadcast. They asked about it in his press conference. I didn't know it would become that big of a story. And like, okay, it wasn't like he was an assistant. I mean, he was on staff a long time ago. It's not like he was Bobby Knight's right-hand man or whatever, but I get it. You know, there's always going to be speculation. Indiana thinks that they're like Alabama football, where it's just like they're going to reclaim the throne. I don't think that they are a blue blood anymore. I think they were a blue blood by virtue of having a generational coach, and haven't followed up with any legitimate long-term success since then. It's a conversation for another day. Okay. Very out of order with how I'm recording this stuff, but that will do it for today's show. You can find me on Twitter at Castellani2014, CastellaniContent.com, where you can find all of our content. If you want to see us on Apple Podcasts or listen to us on Apple Podcasts, you can find us there. You can find us on Spotify. We will be back. Greg Waddell of Sleepers Media will be joining us for Chris and Company this week. We're going to talk Big Ten hoops. We have a few guests coming up over the next several weeks. I think you guys would enjoy some repeat guests as we get close to baseball season. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Anything else? No. Same process, man, as usual. We're continuing to try to grow, and yeah, I'm not doing this diatribe again. Just going to keep rolling the best we can. Love you guys very much. Thank you for all the continued support. It means the world. And shout out Austin Sisler, continuing making me look good behind the camera. Talk to you guys later this week for Chris and Company. Have a great rest of your day. Peace and happiness.